Good morning and welcome to this webinar. My name is Shelley Nicely Groff and I very proudly serve as a Vice Chair of Jewish Council for Public Affairs. I am delighted to introduce today's webinar. Jewish Council for Public Affairs is the network hub of 120 Jewish community relations councils and 17 national organizations. We are committed to bringing to you important information, stimulating discussions, sound strategic advice, and critical advocacy opportunities, all while we are all doing everything that we need to do from our homes. The webinar today is our fourth in a series on Jewish values during a pandemic. Please stay tuned to other educational JCPA webinars in the very near future. And I would also ask you to consider that these are challenging times for all nonprofit organizations such as the JCPA. And this would be a very good time to provide some needed financial support to JCPA and the other organizations that you care about so that they can all continue to function effectively and serve their important community purposes. These are indeed very challenging times. When our existential reality shifts so rapidly, we need to make sense of it and define a path forward that helps us think and act toward our fellow human beings. We turn to trusted and proven voices who help us in making sense of things. They remind us of what we know and what we've been through, and they help us apply that knowledge and experience to changing circumstances. They make us more resilient. Yossi Klein is one such figure. We also know that even when a life-changing event like a pandemic sets in, the rest of the world doesn't come to a standstill. Other issues, made more complicated, continue to demand our attention. Israel is in the throes of a pandemic, and yet it's also in the throes of a crisis in democracy. And we're honored that Yossi is with us this morning to help us make sense of the nexus between the pandemic and the post-election reality in Israel. Yossi is the author of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, a heartfelt plea for peace and new dialogue based on common ground and faith. It was published by HarperCollins in May 2018, coinciding with the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel. The book is a New York Times nonfiction bestseller and tops several Amazon best-selling lists. And personally, it's been recommended to me by so many people that it's on my nightstand. He is also the author of Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation. Published in 2013, it won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Family Foundation Jewish Book of the Year Award. He is a senior fellow with the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative. Yossi writes for the op-ed pages of leading American newspapers, and what a blessing that we get to hear from him today. David, please.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Yossi, if there was ever a time we needed to hear from you in the Jewish community relations world, in the Jewish community, now's the time. So we greatly appreciate your time and your thoughts today.
Well, delighted as always to be with you, David, and thank you for having me.
Thanks. So you're in Israel. What's it like in Israel right now?
You know, I was walking around the streets today, which is something you do only in small dosages, and the streets were almost completely empty. And I said to my wife, who was with me, this really is what Israel feels like when it's at war. You can drive through the streets and they're completely empty, and there are roadblocks. And she said, yeah, but this time the whole world is in the same situation. And that's a very strange experience, you know, to realize that we are in a war situation. We are under siege in a certain sense. And for the first time that I've ever experienced this kind of situation in Israel, we don't feel alone because the whole world is going through this. And you know, David, I was actually thinking, I think you'll appreciate this because this is something you and I talk about, which is the tension within the Jewish people between the universal and the particular. And this is a moment that is both very particularistic and also universal. In one way, it is in some sense, the ultimate vindication of borders, of nations. The first impulse of every country was to shut down, to go inward, close the borders. We did that very early on in Israel. And now other countries are doing it too. Even in Europe, they're even closing their borders against each other. So in that sense, this is really a reaffirmation of the necessity, the protectiveness of borders. On the other hand, this is the first time probably in human history where all of humanity is experiencing the same emotions simultaneously because of social media and because of our almost telepathic interconnectedness. And this is the ultimate universal experience, the ultimate confirmation of the oneness of humanity. So I wonder how we're going to come out of this. Are we going to come out of this more assertively national-minded, or more universal-minded, or some mixture of the two, which is, I think, would be more true to this experience.
Yeah. So drilling down to the particular for a moment. Oh, by the way, I want to ask people, if you'd like to ask questions, we'll be doing our best to monitor the questions. So please put them in the question chat box, and we'll do our best to get to them. So drilling down to the particular for a moment, you recently wrote a very beautiful piece on the role of memory and the Jewish people and Israel, especially Israel. How do these memories play out in this current environment?
I'm turning again to a family context because I think we're all thrown back into our most nuclear forms of existence right now. I was speaking with my daughter and asking her, I said, do you remember being a little girl during the first Gulf War? And she said, of course I do. What do you think I'm thinking about now? And on some level, I'm sure that Israelis across the country are thinking about that moment, those terrifying 6 weeks during the first Gulf War, when we were forced into what were called then the sealed room. And the sealed room was meant to immunize us to a possible gas attack from Saddam Hussein, which of course never happened. But we went through the trauma of the night, the 2 a.m. sirens and the withdrawal into the panicked withdrawal into our sealed room. And I remember forcing our little kids into either their gas masks or the plastic cribs. And the trauma that we went through as young parents and that our kids carry to this day. So, you know, the Israeli collective experience is really layers of unresolved trauma. And then on top of that, there was the trauma of the 4 years of the Second Intifada, the years of the suicide bombings, when we avoided public spaces. And so that's familiar. You know, in the Gulf War, we were confined to the sealed room for the duration of the alert, but then we all would go out to public spaces. In the Second Intifada, 2000 to 2004, we were terrified of public spaces. If we gathered in too great numbers, we would be tempting targets for a suicide killer. And so we tended to cede our public spaces. And gradually during those 4 years, we began to reclaim the spaces, which was our great victory. So today we know that we can't reclaim our public spaces. That's exactly the wrong move. And so in a sense, memory helps us through the fact that we've been through similar situations before, but memory is never exact and it's never precise. And so you approximate what can we learn from our experiences, And I think what we do learn is a sense of resiliency, the confidence in a morning after. You know, we've been through so many emergencies in our 70 years of existence that we know that no matter what happens, there is the morning after, and that gives us a collectively, if not individually, it gives us a certain way to cope.
You know, societies obviously differ in how they're responding to this current moment. You see places like South Korea where there's sort of widespread discipline in responding to government orders, and people put on their masks when they walk around, and they abide by the rules. Other places, and we see this in the United States, there are people who don't listen. There was a coronavirus party in Kentucky where several people got coronavirus. And we're seeing different responses in different places. Where's Israel on this spectrum? What is the Israeli experience in being in the IDF and the like? Where does it place it on that spectrum?
Well, it's very interesting that you're raising the question of the IDF, because we really are, in a sense, two societies: those who serve and those who don't. And the mainstream Israel, despite the anarchic tendencies of Israelis, we know how to respond in times of emergency. We get it. The problem is there are two very substantial communities in Israel that are not part of the mainstream and don't have a relationship with the IDF. And I'm speaking of the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab Israeli community. And there, I would say the level of corona discipline has been spotty. In the ultra-Orthodox community, it's taken a long time, far longer than it should have, for people to internalize the fact that that going to synagogue and convening smachot, weddings, bar mitzvahs is actually a danger to people's lives. And so and in the Arab community, these are communities that are so social, both the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab community. And given the fact that they don't have an intimate and trusting relationship with Israeli authority, that creates some problems. And I think that we haven't begun to really see the impact of that, but I fear that's coming.
We're going to pivot in a second to politics and democracy, but one more social question I have. In the US, we've seen this tremendous rift between sort of the millennial generation and the baby boomer generation. It was brewing before this got started, but now we see a real, almost ugly divide. And then there's, of course, the Gen Xers, people like me who are sandwiched in between these two generations, telling both camps to behave, but they don't seem to be listening to us. Is there this sort of stark generational difference in Israel as there is in the US?
Much less so here. For all kinds of reasons. I think the security situation, the impact of the army, creates a more fluid relationship between the generations. You serve in the army, kids serves in the army. There's a sense of continuity, of shared experience. We all have something to talk about with our kids. You know, we have a basic idea of what our kids go through. Right now, I have 2 out of 3 of my grown children staying with my wife and I, and there's not a question of adhering to the rules, and this is something you experience cross-generationally in Israel, and that's also true for music, for example. We all tend to listen more or less to the same music. The Israeli kids really like the old Israeli music. My generation is really interested to see what the new generation of Israeli music is about. There's a more of a sense of a seamlessness in Israeli culture. that also impacts, of course, social relations.
Sure. So, moving on to the political scene, I don't know that you could have sort of scripted this in a way, but we're going through this pandemic, and there were just the third round of elections in Israel, and all these negotiations have been taking place, and yet there's also word that there's a serious problem in the Israeli democratic process beyond just having repeated elections. Tell us where Israel is at the current moment, and what you've spoken of a crisis in democracy. What is that crisis?
The pandemic Israeli election season, right? But you're right. It's much deeper than the technical crisis that we've gone through of 3 ludicrous elections in the span of 1 year. What we've seen is a convergence of crises. That in different ways these crises have been simmering for the last years, and they've been catalyzed by Netanyahu's legal situation, which he has turned into an ongoing referendum. That's why we keep going to elections every few months here, because Netanyahu has essentially held the system hostage. But that's really the trigger for a much deeper crisis. But before we talk about the crisis, I think it's important to say unequivocally that Israeli democracy is a miracle. And it's a miracle because there is no other country, no other democracy that was born in war, that never knew effectively a day of peace, that went from war to siege to terrorism to economic boycott, delegitimization, and at the same time has a population, most of whom came originally from countries with no democratic tradition. Most Israelis come from families that have roots in in 2 areas of the world, either Eastern Europe or the Middle East. And you bring destitute refugees from these 2 non-democratic regions into a constant pressure cooker. And the result is a more or less thriving democracy. And I would go farther and say that the miracle is not only that Israeli democracy has managed to survive, but that in many ways, Israeli society today is more democratic than it was in the past. Our press is freer. The culture is more pluralistic. Half the Jewish population, the Mizrahim, which were effectively disenfranchised the first 30 years of the country's history, are now governing. Even the condition of Arab Israelis, which is a whole complicated story in itself, is so much better than it was in the early years of the state, politically, economically, socially. And again, that's not to downplay the very serious problems that exist. But if you put all of those factors together, Israeli democracy really is a miracle. But when I say that, I'm not only celebrating our achievements, I'm also expressing a certain anxiety, because a miracle really is a defiance of the laws of nature. A miracle is something you can't take for granted. And Israeli democracy needs to be constantly nurtured and defended. And instead, what we've seen in the last few years is an assault on the legitimacy of our democratic institutions coming from the very top. Now, you in America, you probably don't know what that experience is like, to actually have the leader of your country questioning the legitimacy of some of your democratic institutions. I know that's something that has not happened in America, but we actually have been experiencing that here. And given the fragileness of Israel as a besieged democracy, I actually think that what Netanyahu has done to hit Netanyahu's assault on Israeli democracy in some ways is more severe than Trump's assault on American democracy. I think your institutions, you have 250 years of institutional strength. And Israel we have a very strong society. Maybe in some ways our society is stronger than yours, but our institutions are more fragile. And so that's what worries me about this moment. Now, what's also happened in the last weeks is that the blue and white centrist party and the Likud, the right-wing Likud party, have both staked out positions on democracy that the other sees as a threat to Israel's existence as either a Jewish state or a democratic state. And this is what has made this moment so dangerous. When after the election, Netanyahu came out and said, I won, I have a majority. And blue and white said, you actually don't have a majority. You have 58 out of 120 Knesset seats, which by any calculation does not add up to a majority. And Netanyahu said, well, yes, I do. I have a Jewish majority. Therefore, I have the right to govern. To which blue and white countered, well, we are a Jewish state. We're also a democratic state. Why are we giving Arabs the right to vote if they ultimately don't have a say in who's going to be prime minister? It gets even more complicated because blue and white then proceeds to try to create some kind of a bloc with the United Arab List. The United Arab List is a very problematic party. It contains within its ranks Knesset members who have supported terrorism against Jews, supported the killing of Israeli soldiers, supported Hezbollah and Hamas. At the very least, this is a list that denies the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state. That's a given. And so Benny Gantz, the head of Blue and White, was trying to create a temporary alliance with the list in order to keep Netanyahu from power. Now, I think that was a legitimate move. It would not have been the basis for a stable government. And just imagine if you had a government based dependent on the Arab list, and then we had a conflict on one of our borders. The Arab list would simply pull out of government that instant. And so it's not feasible at this point in the history of Israel to have that kind of relationship. And just parenthetically, I think a really important point to make is that the great anomaly of Arab-Israeli politics is that the majority of Arab-Israeli citizens are more integrationist than nationalist, are more Israeli integrationist than Palestinian nationalist. But the leaders whom they send to the Knesset tend to be more Palestinian nationalist than Israeli integrationist. And so what Benny Gantz was trying to do was figure out how do you begin to absorb into the mainstream the Arab Israelis without creating too much dependency on the Arab list. Now, meanwhile, the Likud is saying it's all illegitimate. You can't even form a technical bloc with what the Likud said are terrorists. The Likud calls the Arab list terrorists. And so for the Likud, the fact that blue and white tried to create a bloc with the Arab list broke a red line in Israeli politics and threatens Israel as a Jewish state. And from the point of view of blue and white and its supporters, the Likud's attempt to invalidate the right of Arabs to be part of a Knesset majority was an assault on the heart of Israeli democracy. This is the crisis that we were in. And then you factor in the challenge of the Supreme Court against the the speaker, I won't go into all the technicalities, but the Supreme Court forced the Likud Speaker of the Knesset to step down and to convene the House, and he refused. This was the worst crisis of authority in Israel's history, and it's happening in the middle of a pandemic.
Mm.
So it is, as you like to say in America, a perfect storm.
Mm.
And that is the background to Benny Gantz's stunning announcement yesterday that he's going to essentially abandon his partners in blue and white and throw in his lot with the Netanyahu-led government, which is something he has fought bitterly to prevent for the last year.
Right. So with the Arab bloc, blue and white would have had 61 seats, but there were members of blue and white that wouldn't abide by that, wouldn't form such a coalition. They couldn't peel off any of the right-wing bloc to bolster their Knesset representation. And now here we are, and I just, even overnight, I think, in time, we learned that Gantz is set to be deputy prime minister, foreign minister, and blue and white party has just completely come apart, and Yesh Atid now is now part of the opposition. How's that? And as I understand it, tell me if this is correct, Gantz would then become prime minister in September of 2021.
Yeah. Nobody believes that Netanyahu is going to honor the rotation. The conversations that I've been having today with friends is really about trying to figure out who is Benny Gantz. And it comes down to three options. Mm-hmm. He's either a fool whom Netanyahu has completely manipulated, or he is a scoundrel who took people like me and led us down a blind alley and then sold us out for his own personal gain. Or he is who he says he is, a soldier who entered politics for only one reason, which was to try to save the country, and realizes now that the agenda that he had committed himself to for the last year, which was preventing Netanyahu from being prime minister, has been superseded by a new emergency, which is we can't have a crisis of authority, a competition between the Knesset authority and the Supreme Court's authority in the middle of a pandemic. We need a stable government. And so he has now stepped up, sacrificed his political future, because in all likelihood, this guy is not going to be prime minister. And I think he knows it. And
right.
so
the charitable interpretation is he's a patriot who didn't win fourth elections in the middle of all this mayhem.
I lean toward the charitable interpretation of this move, but I have to tell you, David, as a blue and white, a passionate blue and white voter, I've been voting for centrist parties since the late 1980s. These small parties that come and go, and finally I felt here's a strong, stable party. What this move has done is destroy the center. I am profoundly saddened by this. I think that Gantz may have been right, but the price will be steep. And I feel at this moment bereft. That's the truth.
Right. But I know that you're an optimist at heart. And there's even some optimism in how you wanted this discussion framed. So what does an optimist do in this moment? What is a possible alternative scenario that might emerge over time that would make Israel a stronger democracy and more stable and with a stronger vision for the future than it currently has?
So David, look, I have to tell you, I'm an Israeli optimist, which qualifies the optimism. It's a very particular form of optimism. And what it says is, yes, we're going to get through whatever crisis reality throws at us. But it's really going to be close. It's going to be a close call, as it so often has been in Israeli history. To be an Israeli optimist means you're optimistic about the long term, not so much about the short term. And my hope about the next year or two is that the political system will pull back from the edge of the abyss, and I think that Gantz has now calmed the fever, to mix metaphors here, and in first of all, we'll be able to deal in a reasonable way with the pandemic. And one of the problems, by the way, that we've had in the last weeks is that many Israelis didn't trust Netanyahu. Netanyahu was projecting self-confidence and assurance, but lots of Israelis were asking themselves, is he taking charge and pushing us into this emergency mode because that's really where we need to be? Or is that because it happens to be useful for him politically? Now, I think we know now that he was right, but initially he did not have that credibility. So Gantz stepping in is going to restore somewhat credibility to the system. It will force the two sides, the Supreme Court and the Knesset, to stand down. The most important part of this process of Gantz entering the government is that his faction is going to be given the Justice Ministry. Netanyahu appointed an anti-justice minister who for the last month has been at war with the legal system. So whoever comes in from Gantz's side is going to restore the dignity, the credibility of the justice system, which is absolutely crucial for the future of Israeli democracy. So in that sense, I think that we're going to see some positive steps. To take this, if we can, a step further, assuming that Corona winds down by summer, after the summer, Trump is going to be up for his election and is going to need some victories. And I suspect that he's going to resurrect the Trump plan and turn to Israel and say, what are you going to give me? Having Benny Gantz's party in the government could help restrain Netanyahu's tendency to go for annexation. And what worries me most in the post-Corona period is a right-wing government without restraint that will start annexing settlements, start annexing the Jordan Valley, and I'm hoping that having Gantz in there will act as some break on that temptation.
Going back to the sort of politics of the pandemic for a second, you stated that Bibi came out very clear-headed and strong about measures that the Israeli society would have to take. Many of us read that speech. But in the U.S., and I'm wondering if there's the same in Israel, is there a sort of ideological denial camp that exists that says this is all just a hoax of the media or the left? I know that you said Haredi Jews are abiding by this, but that's not an ideological response.
No. The Haredi, and again, we're talking now about a minority of the Haredi community. Most of the Haredi community was late to mobilization, but it is now largely mobilized. You have pockets who are still resistant, but the Haredi logic was not it wasn't based on any conspiracy theory. It was simply saying that our way offers the best protection for the Jewish people and for individual Jews, which of course is a kind of very dangerous magical thinking. Faith is one thing, magical thinking is another. And much of the Haredi world has been prisoner of a very dangerous form of magical thinking, which is a denial of reality. And we saw that play out in the initial phase of the corona epidemic. So no, you don't have that. And I think that as a whole, this is a sane society. You know, you don't have people going out and buying guns. You know, that's not happening here. We have other problems,
Right.
but it doesn't. Our problems don't take those pathological expressions.
Mm-hmm. How much of the discourse, and this comes out of a question that I'm being asked from one of the viewers, how much of the discourse really centers around people in poverty, people that are most vulnerable in this at this time? Is there a lot of political discussion about making sure that they receive protection from the economic collapse that might ensue?
This is happening. Here we are behind you in this conversation, and that points to a larger problem with Netanyahu's governance. Netanyahu is very effective when the problem is existential. Iran, you know, not to forget that it was Netanyahu who really galvanized the international conversation on the nuclear Iran threat. When there are threats coming from our borders, you can more or less trust Netanyahu. And I think that it's a useful metaphor that Netanyahu's first response to Corona was, we're shutting the borders, because that's how he thinks. Now, in this particular case, that's not enough. Because what we are seeing, and I fear that we're going to be seeing more of this, as God forbid the virus takes deeper hold in the coming days here, is that Netanyahu, who has been prime minister for 10 long years, has criminally neglected the health system, which is overburdened, it is outdated, and again, God forbid, in the face of real calamity, might not be able to cope. And that is really, I think, part of an expression of Netanyahu's failure to deal with domestic issues. And we're still waiting for a serious government offer to business people here, to people who are really hurting. And I imagine that that's coming, but it's symptomatic of where this government has failed. And I think that one of the reasons why Netanyahu was so desperate to have Gantz come in is he didn't want to take the blame alone, because the blame is coming. There will be payback from the Israeli electorate for the last 10 years of social neglect.
So, related question: as far as you know, are the hospitals here in Israel ready for what's about to hit them? I mean, you see what's happening in New York right now, and obviously we saw what's happened in Italy and Spain. Do Israel feel ready?
I think we're ready for the next phase. If Corona here is going to gradually intensify, I think we can handle that. We are not ready for anywhere near ready for the kinds of crises that have hit the countries you mentioned.
So I'm going back and forth from the pandemic to the politics, and here's a question. One of JCPA's vice chairs, David Bohm. Yossi, what is the likelihood that Netanyahu's trial will go forward, and what will the impact of a guilty verdict be?
I didn't hear the question, I'm sorry.
What is the likelihood that Bibi's trial will go forward, and what will the impact of a guilty verdict be?
Yeah. I think the trial will begin as soon as it's reasonably safe to re-inhabit our public spaces. The impact of a guilty verdict will be Netanyahu's resignation. I think that will be clear. How long will the trial last? Half a year, 3/4 of a year? How long can it go on? We're talking about 3 trials. And so Netanyahu, I think, has really has successfully bought himself another year, in all likelihood. And again, depending on how long the state of acute crisis lasts, if it begins to calm down, then I think we'll see a resumption of the procedures.
So in the beginning, you started by referencing this dichotomy between the universal and the particular, and how the universal forces may actually create a more unified reality in the future if we're going to be optimistic about it worldwide, not just within Israel. And I'm wondering how that might play out for peace. We see images of Israelis and Palestinian cooperation. I don't know if that fully mirrors what's happening on the ground. We already saw momentum toward Israel and the Arab countries, particularly the Gulf states, getting to a more peaceful reality. How do you think these forces might affect the prospects of peace between Israel and the
Look, David, I hate to put it this way, but it depends how devastating the coming weeks and months will be. Right now, the Middle East is still in business as usual mode. What will happen in Iran? I think that's in some ways the most interesting question. The government's credibility. Say it again.
Now that you've asked it, yes, tackle that one. Right. By the way, with the morbidity rate in Iran reaching just catastrophic proportions as well, there's estimates that, and this may be an exaggeration, who knows, but that 3.5 million Iranians could die with the current crisis sweeping that region.
Yeah, I read this stunning article in the Atlantic a couple weeks ago that did the arithmetic and claimed that the real dimensions of the crisis there might be tenfold of what the government is actually owning up to. Mm-hmm. So, the Iranian regime had already taken some pretty serious hits to its credibility domestically before this happened. So the best solution would be a popular uprising against the regime. That's always been the best hope, and one of the reasons that I was so outraged at the previous administration's policy on Iran was that it gave up the effort to try to support popular opposition to the regime. That was part of its, from my point of view, surrender to the regime. But the question really is whether popular resistance will grow. And I would guess that the Iranian people must be in a state of deep anger, at least many Iranians. This crisis confirmed the worst fears about what that regime represents internally, never mind to the rest of us. The fact that Iran has been the greatest conveyor of the virus in the Middle East also says something about what happens when a regime becomes so poisoned and so hateful and so obsessed with undermining its neighbors rather than in functioning as a conduit for taking care of its own people. So there will be a lot a lot to unpack in the aftermath. As far as Israelis and Palestinians go, it's so interesting to hear the discourse here, because you'll hear Israelis say, well, this proves that we need separation from the Palestinians. And others will say, well, this proves that separation is impossible because we're all experiencing the same thing. So, depending what your starting point is, you can always find confirmation in the situation.
So another question, this is from Rabbi Neil Borovitz, who's also a longtime JCPA board member and executive committee member. He's asking about energy prices. And, we know Israel's become a major exporter of natural gas. Do we know if this is affecting Israel in the long term or short term in a drastic way?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. It's really out of my pay grade, those kinds of questions. So.
Right. Another question here. Is there any movement in Israel to set term limits on prime minister? This is a 10-year run for Bibi, and Ben-Gurion certainly was in power for a long time. Does anybody talk about that at all, reforming the system that way?
Yes, there is some talk about it. And I would guess that as soon as we find ourselves in the post-Bibi era, that will be one of the very first bills put forth in the Knesset.
Yeah. So here's another question. One of the viewers is saying, why is it that that the Arab population is more integrationist, as you say, but at the same time tends to vote for nationalists? You spoke of the reality, but you didn't tell us why that's so. What is the reason for that?
It's one of the great mysteries of Israeli politics, because when you look at the polls, consistently, a majority, even a strong majority of Arab Israelis respond in most of the ways that Jewish Israelis would hope they would respond. We want to be part of the mainstream. We consider ourselves Israeli. It is only a small percentage of the Arab Israeli public that identify themselves as Palestinian first. A majority actually call themselves Arab first, and then Israeli, then Palestinian. And in one poll that I saw recently, a majority of Arab Israelis, a small majority, but nevertheless, answered affirmatively when asked whether they are proud to be Israeli. Now I think that's extraordinary. Under these circumstances of Israel being in permanent war with the Palestinian people, with much of the Arab world, with a very uncertain status of Arab Israelis in a Jewish state, and yet to still have a majority of Arab Israelis say they're proud to be Israelis, that gives me tremendous hope. And so then what I then ask when I speak to Arab Israelis, I say, so how do you send an Azmi Bashara who had to flee the country because he was feeding information to Hezbollah during the war? How do you send Azmi Bashara to represent you in the Knesset? And then you're surprised when Jewish Israelis don't trust the Arab Israeli community? So something here has to change. There is a deep conservatism in the Arab Israeli community. I know there have been efforts made to create new parties that are more integrationist than Palestinian nationalist or Islamist. Those are our choices. We have basically three options in Arab politics today. You're either a Palestinian nationalist, a pan-Arab nationalist, or an Islamist. None of those three options lead to Jewish-Arab cooperation. And so we really desperately need, and what we need here is an Arab-Jewish party, a joint list that is integrationist and that is mainstream, that affirms the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish majority democratic state. And I do know, again, I know of one serious effort that was attempted in the last election. It didn't actually get off the ground, but there are people in the Arab community who are desperate for this to happen.
Yeah. It sounds very much like what happened, when with the Arab Spring as well, that there was just no source of legitimacy for ultimately those people who were challenging the status quo.
Yeah.
They couldn't turn themselves into a political platform.
Yeah. I mean, look at Palestinian society. You speak to Palestinians, everybody hates the Palestinian Authority. It's corrupt. Abbas is in his 14th year of a 4-year elected term. And then I say, okay, great. You hate the PA. Why is Hamas your only alternative? Why hasn't the Palestinian middle class in the West Bank created a reformist movement? What's going on in Palestinian politics? Why this total abdication of responsibility for an alternative politics? And so this question that I ask Arab Israelis who are functioning in a democracy, they don't have that excuse that you have in the Arab world.
Mhm.
Why haven't you been able to come up with a politics that breaks the mold of parties that even an Israeli Jew like myself, who is fully committed to integrating Arab Israelis into the mainstream, into Israeli identity, into creating a shared civic space that won't compromise the Jewishness of the state, but will create an expanded civic space that Arabs and Jews can share. Even Israelis like myself cringed at the notion of a blue and white United Arab List government. And so give me something to work with. Give me something that will allow me to challenge the status quo. But what we have now, this is just not good enough.
So Pesach is just around the corner. Many of us will be having a Seder with our nuclear families. We're gonna maybe we'll be webcasting just as we are now to our family in Israel, or to our friends, and so forth. And in fact, at least some Israeli rabbinical figures have said that it's actually halakhically feasible to do that. And I know that there's been a debate about that recently. But here we are also in the middle of a plague. So how is that going to play out in the Jewish psyche, particularly during Pesach? What are we going to be hearing from the various rabbinical camps in Israel and
I don't really look for spiritual guidance to the Israeli rabbinate.
So give it to us. We want to hear from you then.
I'm working on a book project, which is about the extraordinary Jewish success story of the post-Holocaust era, and it's about the wisdom of survival. How did we make the leap from the abyss of May 1945, when the camps opened, to a generation later, reaching the apotheosis of Jewish power, success, self-confidence. And so that's a story that I'm really sitting with now. And I'm reading the books that I have on my desk now. I have a pile of fantastic books about the DP camps in 1945, 46, the displaced persons camps in Germany. 300,000 Jews moved to Germany after the war. Some are there, those who have been liberated from the camps in Germany, but many other Jews moved from Eastern Europe, and you have by 1946 300,000 Jews in these DP camps. And reading about Pesach, the Seder, in these camps. I just read a story today about the first Seder. This was May 1945, April 1945. A group of American rabbis who were attached to the army from the Jewish Welfare Board conducted a Seder in Goebbels' castle. Goebbels' abandoned castle. They took it over and had a Seder for Jewish GIs. There are stories here that we need to re-own, that we need to reclaim. And, you know, we look toward Judaism for wisdom, for sustenance. I'm looking toward Jewish history, and not ancient Jewish history. I'm looking to the story of 1945 to 2020. How did we get from there to here? That's the story that I think we need to celebrate, and to realize, you know, this is, and we all know this. This is an apocalyptic moment. We had a visitation last night from a science fiction movie in our home. We had a guy dressed completely in white with a plastic helmet coming in to administer a test to our son, who's in quarantine because he flew home from New York last week on a plane that turned out to have 60 people who tested positive.
Wow.
So we're living, you know, it's like really somebody stepping out of a Hollywood horror film in my living room. And so we all know this is a kind of apocalyptic moment. But we also know that the Jewish people already went through an apocalypse. We went through the end of the world. In 1945, the Jewish people experienced a kind of a collective death. And we had a kind of a revelation, an anti-Sinai, an anti-revelation moment of the end of the Jewish people. That's what the end of the Jewish people looked like. And yet, within weeks, the DP camps were organizing. There was this massive relief coming from American Jewry, from the Yishuv, from British Jewry. There was this sense of what Jews do. How do we confront crisis? We draw on memory. And this brings us back to your first question. You know, for Israelis, we immediately went into memory mode with being quarantined. Right, we've been through that before. And when we face crises, we know that we have the fortitude to get through it. And I would say that Judaism gives individual Jews the wisdom and the strength to cope with difficulty, but Jewish history gives the Jewish people the wisdom and the strength to cope with difficulty. And one of the things we're going to need to think about, David, and this is certainly, I know this is very much on your mind and on the minds of the communal leadership in America, is how is this going to change the Jewish agenda? How is it going to change the philanthropic agenda, the political agenda? How is it going to change the relationship between Israelis and American Jews? There are so many questions here, but what we need to really draw on is memory. We have 4,000 years of institutional memory, and what Pesach gives us is that access, an easy access to our story. And maybe if I could just say one more thing about this, because something that I've really been struggling for a way to express this. Humanity is in the 21st century is apparently going to be one apocalyptic crisis after another for humanity. We all sense it. We know we are in a time of convergence of multiple crises. And we, as a people, we really know what it means to survive apocalypse. And there's something about that story that we need to, again, that we need to first of all, tell ourselves, because that's what the Seder is. We need to be sitting down among ourselves and telling this story. And then I think when we have a sense of how we understand our story, then we can really begin speaking to the world out of the
Mm.
wisdom of 4,000 years. And we are one of the very few peoples on the planet that has 4,000 years of memory. There are very few peoples that remember uninterruptedly, that have gone through every era of human history and remember it. We can access that memory. And so there's something in that wisdom of the accumulated experience of human history that filtered through Jewish history that we need now in the 21st century to convey to ourselves, to our kids, and to the world.
So the world's not done with us Jews yet. We still have a role.
I think our role is now, this generation.
Beautiful. What a powerful way to end a very powerful conversation. Yossi, thank you so much. We're going to probably ask you to do this again sometime because this is going to be an ever-evolving situation, and we need your wisdom now more than ever. So thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Truly a pleasure.
Yeah, we're going to tell you about our next webinar is on Wednesday, April 1st with none other than Natan Sharansky. That's not an April Fool's joke. We're going to have Natan with us next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. So please join us then. You'll get news on that shortly. And want to thank you all. I want to wish you all the very best of health and sanity in this moment, and wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and keep well. Take care, David.
Take care.